Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Charlie Banner and welcome to the 6th episode of We Got Planning News for You. As you can see, I've had the decorators in the last week to try and emulate Chris's library. They've done a very good job too, but there's no owl as yet. Thank you all for joining us on another lovely sunny afternoon. I think it's the third or fourth show when it's been scorching outside. If you've got a garden or balcony, feel free to take us outside on your iPad or laptop with a beer or gin and tonic. I must confess, I didn't completely foresee that my life would, on the very last week of my fourth decade, end up with me as a blob on a screen in the sunshine as an accompaniment to a drink. But there you are. I think that's good. I have, in the last few days, been perfecting the ultimate summer dress code for remote hearings. Hence my current garb, which I've been doing remote comms all day, business on the top and beachwear on the bottom half. That's probably far too much information. Yeah, that's the way of the new world. So in our new digital inquiries law, you never quite know what the inspector is wearing beyond the top half of the screen. You just have to pray that in court, the court usher doesn't say court rise when the judge comes in. As usual, we've got the Q&A function, which some of you have been actively pursuing already. Please do keep the comments flowing. We hugely welcome that. And we'll follow up any points afterwards that we haven't covered on our LinkedIn page as usual. Once again, can I reiterate that whilst this is a free show, we greatly encourage donations to the NHS Clap for Our Carers COVID-19 Just Giving page, or a charity of your choice if you so prefer. Now let's introduce the panel. So can I ask each of you in turn to say, as usual, who you are, where you are, and what you're drinking this evening. And Sasha in particular, you're drinking something special, I gather.
Yep, I'll let Mary introduce herself first before I bore everyone with what I'm drinking.
Good evening from Wandsworth. It's Mary Cook from Town Legal, and I'm drinking gin and tonic.
It's Chris Young from number 5 Chambers. I am in Cheltenham Town, as you can see. David is a football fan, so the memo I got was you had to go football. And I am drinking champagne for a variety of reasons, but I'll let Sasha come on to that.
You've got a straw for that bottle, Chris.
And my name's Paul Tucker from King's Chambers, although at the moment I'm currently out in the grounds just outside Chris's house in Cheltenham at Hagrid's Hut. I'm actually an hour and a half from Barnard Castle, if anybody's interested.
Go for a spin and test your eyesight, Paul, afterwards.
What I'm planning to do.
I'm in Oxfordshire, Sasha White, Landmark Chambers. I haven't got any Hogwarts-inspired background because I couldn't get a photo of the loos at Slytherin, so I'm afraid you have to make it with my study. And I've got champagne because it's my daughter's 21st birthday, and I drove to see her and have a sober picnic, and I've driven back, not had a drink, so I'm going to toast her now. So, Kate, happy 21st.
Using the world's lamest bottle of champagne as well, I see.
Did you go the lamest? I didn't want David to think we lived up to the stereotype, so I'll have the Gerard Byrne later.
And I am drinking, in tribute to them. I am drinking. Oh, you can't. Here we are. We can't see the background. Sam Smith's. Sam Smith's raspberry beer. I shall be referring later to the raspberry they blew at the unsuccessful appellant in the Gascoigne Wood case. We have, as you all know, a very special guest today in the form of David Smith. David, hello. A planning inspector of some 20 years standing, who's now the planning inspector's professional lead for planning appeals. And we're delighted, David, to have you with us. Our very first inspector on the show, or not. And this is my challenge for the Q&A. Can you guess, dear viewers, which one of us 5 barristers has in fact trained as a planning barrister? It answers in the Q&A function, so you're not quite.
I think you mean a planning inspector, Charlie, not as a planning barrister.
Yeah, there's no training for that.
Yes, one of us is not a fraud, at least. Yes, one of bastard. So, David, we've got a lot of it. On a serious note, we've got a huge amount to talk about, not least the latest bulletin, which some of our viewers may not appreciate have seen yet, from the Inspectorate, published this afternoon, I think with also a commensurate publication by MHCLG as well. So lots of interesting things to talk about regarding the state of play, regarding the progress of planning appeals by digital means whilst in-person events are not possible, and what may happen after that. As usual, our guest interview with David is in the second half of the show. But David, as we say to all the guests, and I said to you before, please do chip in relation to any of our early discussions to the extent that you'd like to do so, but no obligation if you prefer not to. As regular viewers will...
You haven't asked me what I'm drinking.
No, I haven't. Well, you tell us now. What are you... what are you...
Let's see.
Oh,
very good. We are. And yes, as we have trailed last week, David is a Spurs fan, and that is something which we're particularly pleased with, given that we have three objectives in this show. Firstly, to inform you. Secondly, to entertain you, and you'll be the judges of whether we succeed in that. And thirdly, is to try and force Sasha to wear a Spurs shirt, in relation to which we've been completely unsuccessful. However, David has provided us with, I hope you can all see this now my screen share hopefully is not disabled like last week. Here is David in the Spurs finest kit, alongside an inspector whose decision we'll be discussing next week. Is Inspector Roger Clues, wearing the Ecuador national kit. I gather that's where he's from. But he is wearing the Ecuador national kit, and Roger Clues, of course, decided or reached findings in relation to the North Essex Authority's Local Plan Part 1, which we'll be discussing next week. So I'll just stop my video share. Now, we're straight on to our first topic this week, court cases, plural of the week, and we have no fewer than 3 cases to discuss. The first of which relates to listed buildings and the judgment in the Supreme Court in Dill. And Paul, you and Chris are going to, for the first time ever, discuss a case which neither of you is involved in.
Which means neither of us lost this one, so it's an absolute joy. Although one of my pupils did lose the case because he was acting for the interested party, bless him. So shout out for John. Yeah, this is a Supreme how to lose friends and influence people. So Supreme Court decision, and it's a fairly extreme case of the courts not engaging with the merits, in inverted commas. There's a chap called Mr. Dill who owns a property called Idleycote House in the Cotswolds. It's lovely, 9 bedrooms, was on the market in 2009. And in 2009, Mr. Dill took a couple of urns. These aren't small little urns. These are big lead urns from outside his house, and sold them for auction for £55,000. They had to be removed by crane. They were sitting on plinths. And they'd originally been put in outside the house in 1973, but earlier they'd been in front of a house called Rest House until 1939. So these are urns which were created in the 18th century, put outside somewhere else, and in the 20th century moved to outside his house. So he thought he was fairly safe getting rid of them, not attached to anything, freestanding, but very, very heavy. Well, nothing happened then for 7 years. And then Stratford-on-Avon Council found out that he moved these urns and sold them and got rid of them and didn't know where they were, and served a listed building enforcement notice on him and said, go and find them and put them back, please. Rather put out, Mr. Dill argued before the inspector on the enforcement notice appeal, these are not buildings, these are not part of the buildings, they're not a curtilage building, these were urns, and they were not affixed to the land, etc. Well, he lost. And he lost because the inspector said, I am bound by the fact that these urns were added to the statutory listing in 1986. So just to record on the timescale then, they're not put there until the 20th century. When the house is listed in 1966, the urns aren't there. They're put there in 1973. They're added to the statutory list in 1986. Mr. Dill feels a bit aggrieved by this. He appeals to the High Court, and the High Court says, no, terribly sorry, we are bound, and the inspector was bound by what's in the statutory list. They are listed. Court of Appeal, terribly sorry, Mr. Dill. I know it's a bit unfair, and I know you're still looking for these urns, but we are bound by the statutory list. So he went up to the Supreme Court. Not many cases get to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has to be interested in the case and think it decides a matter of public interest before they'll grapple with it. Well, in this one, the courts really, truly did think that it raised an issue of interest. And in a very firm judgment, the court held that Mr. Dill was entitled to argue that these urns were not actually buildings. He was entitled to argue that they weren't curtilagely listed by virtue of being the curtilage, and he was entitled to argue that they weren't buildings at all, notwithstanding that they were on the statutory list. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it means that the statutory list may have some evidential value as to whether something's a building, but it's not determinative. Secondly, it means there's a big case called Skerritts, which is the case we always turn to when looking at buildings, and we look at things like permanence, fixation, scale, as deciding whether or not something is or isn't a building. So the court said to Mr. Dill, fantastic news, you can go back and argue this before an inspector. Mr. Dill must have been absolutely delighted, because Mr. Dill would have been sitting there going, well, couldn't you decide that they weren't a building? I've now been before, what are we, 9 judges, 1 inspector, the entirety of the planning committee. Could somebody tell me whether this is a building or not, rather than just saying it is or it isn't? Well, Lord Carnworth said, well, it's going to have to be remitted back to the inspector to decide, but he did something extraordinary. And it's thumbs up to Robert Carnworth. He doesn't get praise of the week this week, but he gets a mini praise from me, because he makes it absolutely abundantly clear that he thinks it would be crackers to send Mr. Dill out there looking for these urns wherever they may be. And I spent a couple of minutes on Google this afternoon seeing if I can find the urns, but I've got pictures of them. They're very exciting, but they're nowhere to be found. So I hope that Mr. Dill will no longer be troubled by an enforcement notice requiring him to go out, find urns that nobody knows where they are, and put them back somewhere that they hadn't been until the 1970s.
Chris, what's your take on it?
Yeah, well, I agree with obviously everything that Paul has said there. I note in paragraph 54, Lord Carnworth saying it's not enough that an object may be of special artistic or historic interest in itself. The special interest must be linked to the status as a building. And I happen to know about this case because Mr. Dill has a friend, and his friend is somebody that I met in the playground. And a few years ago, he said to me, my friend's having a problem with some urns in his garden over in Stratford, and wondered if you might be able to help us. You know, as we often do when anybody approaches you and says, I've got this planning problem. I said, I'm really busy at the moment. Well, what a mistake that was. Hey? I could have ended up in the Supreme Court again. And instead it was Richard Harwood. And well done to Richard. I mean, Paul was commenting on the judicial indulgence of decisions. And look at what happened here. We've had the High Court say that the decision was good, the inspector's decision was good, and we've had that from the Court of Appeal. You've got to have real perseverance and persuade your clients to go all the way. And that has paid dividends. I spoke to Richard today, and Richard said the issue about the listing being conclusive wasn't actually something the local authority took at the original written rep's appeal. It was something that the inspector concluded himself and only emerged in his written decision. So that's obviously something to just watch out for.
Chris,
well done, Richard Harwood. Bad luck, me.
If I heard you right, saying you met fellow stakeholders in the planning system in the playground, I'm assuming you were with your kids.
Yes.
Been asked, just to clarify, you've been asked by Chris, as number 5 chambers are proud sponsors of Birmingham City. Why are you not wearing a Blues shirt? As a West Brom fan, I can't resist. But
well, I am in fact an Aston Villa fan, but I can't find that top at the moment. Yeah, thanks. So David, I felt I had to wear something, and Cheltenham Town. I mean, okay, they're not great.
I should also, before we go further, say that Sasha, I don't know if Sasha has acquired a. There we are. This is Sasha's brand new anti-Spurs device. This week.
Can I just say, Sasha features later on. I'm going to talk about one of his cases, and it's one of the most defining and, frankly, pinnacles of his career. And you've just ruined the whole thing, John.
Not for the first time.
I was about to say, don't worry, Chris, I'm used to it. He's my neighbour.
Yes, a defining moment for Sasha's career of court cases. The case didn't go to court. Next case is Swire, and from listed buildings to EIA. And Mary, you're going to tell us about this case.
Yes, so Swire was is a good example of a the quashing of a negative screening direction made by the Secretary of State. And at first blush, this seems unusual when I tell you that this was a 2.9 hectare site and the proposed development was simply up to 20 dwellings on previously developed land, which had an open, unrestricted B2 use down in Kent at a place called Thruxton Mill. However, the site was in the Kent Downs AONB, but the really unusual thing was that this site was one of 4 sites which had been used during the BSE crisis to dispose of animal carcasses. It was a fact that was well known locally, but not apparently well known by the developer. Various risk assessment reports were put in to support the planning application, but those risk assessment reports made no reference to the risk of contamination from BSE. However, a local doctor drew it to the attention of the developer and the council. The developer's consultants dismissed the risk from BSE as being negligible. To be fair to the council, who first of all issued a negative screening opinion, they didn't dismiss it as being negligible, but they took the view that it was something that could be managed via planning conditions. And when the Secretary of State was asked about it, the Secretary of State basically took the same view. This is a decision of Lang J, and it's an excellent read if you're interested in a summary of all the relevant legislation and also case law. She takes us through Libus. Some of you may recall a case about an egg production facility where the council thought an EIA wasn't required there because they had all the information in a planning application, and that was deemed to be the wrong approach. And other cases like Loader and Cat, but the 2 really critical ones were the Court of Appeal in Gillespie. Remember that? That was about a former gasworks site proposed for residential development, where the Secretary of State's decision to grant a permission without an ES was quashed. And again, in that case, it was based on reliance on remediation conditions, but the court said there was an insufficient assessment of the contingencies and the uncertainties, and there was an assumption that was unjustified that at each stage a favourable result would be achieved. And the court also considered, again, Robert Carnworth in the Supreme Court in Champion, again a case where the council made a mistake in concluding that no EIA would be required for a proposed, there were 2 silos and a lorry park and a wash bay discharging into a nearby river, which was an SSSI and a SAC. And it was agreed by the time they got to the Supreme Court that the council had erred and that there should have been an EIA. But there, Robert Carnworth declined to exercise his discretion to grant relief. And so this is an example of the court applying Gillespie, because they found that there was a lack of expert assessment and risk assessment on the nature of the BSE risk, and that it was inappropriate, because this was a novel and difficult issue, it was inappropriate to make assumptions that the remedial measures would be successful, and there was yet again an unjustified assumption. And the other thing that's interesting about this, bearing in mind the next case that we're going to discuss, is that unusually the Secretary of State relied upon an internal email sent by the civil servant who had assessed the application. But that actually rather backfired, because the civil servant suggested that in fact it was a finely balanced decision, and also suggested that in his opinion it was an attempt by objectors to, quote, have another bite at the cherry. And the judge took a pretty dim view of that email, although accepting that that email was not evidence of the Secretary of State's decision. So interesting case, and a reminder that sometimes even small schemes can warrant an environmental impact assessment.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of comments on this myself, and just on that point about the civil servant describing the issue as finely balanced. At the end of the judgment, Lord Carnworth went on to say it wasn't clear what he meant by finely balanced, but that, sorry, not Lord Carmouth, Justice Lang, went on to remind readers that Lord Carmouth in Champion Case had said, if in doubt, do an EIA, essentially, applying the precautionary principle in the context of EIA, where there's doubt, then generally that doubt should be resolved in favour of doing it. And what I would say, which some listeners may have heard me say directly to them, it is don't be too scared about doing it. And so unless there's some massive timescale or commercial reason, in a case which is finally done, often the greater risk is actually in not doing an EIA and lending yourself open to challenge. Because the court, if one is done, the courts take a very light touch approach to the quality of EIA, and that's been reiterated most recently by the Court of Appeal in the Heathrow, in the bits of the Heathrow Court of Appeal judgment which were unsuccessful for the claimants.
So who was in that case, Charlie? Remind me.
That was the bit that I won. I didn't give submissions on the bit that went down. I left that to somebody else. But yes, in the Court of Appeals reiterated that time and time again, and so therefore you're unlikely to, as the author of an EIA or as the local planning authority, you're unlikely to feel the sting of a challenge on the basis the EIA wasn't long enough, wasn't detailed enough. But if you don't do one in a case that's finely balanced, then this is an illustration that could end up causing more problems, more delay and more cost. And the second thing is I would just add that whilst it is often said and has often been said on this show, and with some justification, that the High Court is a little bit too generous to planning authorities sometimes, and inspectors, dare I say, and the Secretary of State in legal challenges to the reasoning of their decisions. This case is a good illustration that judicial review can still be a meaningful weapon despite that in the right case. And in this instance, the defendant couldn't hide behind the Wednesbury principle that a decision, as long as it was within the range of reasonable responses, was not one that would be quashed. The court scrutinised and interrogated the reasoning in some detail and found for the claimants. So JR shouldn't be thought of as a lost cause, despite the general attitude and dare I say even presumption by the High Court that a decision, they'll take a lot of convincing that a decision is unlawful. Next up, Sasha can barely contain his excitement at our third topic, and so we're not going to let Sasha open on it. We're going to let Chris open on it instead. So over to you, Chris.
This is the case of Tower Hamlets and the Secretary of State, and it's dynamite, basically. Absolute dynamite. Acting for Tower Hamlets is one Sasha White, just there on my screen, and what an extraordinary outcome. So this is a court case about a huge 1,500 home scheme at the Westbury Printworks in East London, and it's the planning equivalent of the Dominic Cummings affair. The Secretary of State has now consented to his own judgment being quashed, and he's done so on the basis of accepting that there is an apparent bias in the decision. Now, that is an extraordinary admission. That's not admitting there was bias, so not accepting bias outright, but apparent bias, which is the impression of bias. Now, critical to this whole story is to understand the date of the Secretary of State's decision. Here it is. It's the 14th of January this year, 2020. And the reason that is significant is that if we think about the appeal and we think about the background, this was a scheme for 1,500 homes. 700 homes have been already granted on that site, but this was a resubmission for a much bigger scheme, obviously twice the scale. Some of the towers, I don't know if you can see that, some of the towers are 42 stories high. Okay, that's the best I can do for graphics. Right, I can't share the screen. And what happened was Tower Hamlets didn't determine the application. Westbury went to appeal. It was recovered by the Secretary of State. Westbury Developments is a company owned by Richard Desmond, and Richard Desmond owns Northern and Shell, which is a development company, and a former donor of the Conservative Party and UKIP, and a former proprietor of Express newspapers. And the Secretary of State recovered the decision, and the Secretary of State asked an inspector, obviously, to hold an appeal. David Prentice was the inspector. It happened in August 2019. he wrote a very detailed report recommending refusal. The reasons he recommended refusal were principally because of the effect on heritage assets, not just any heritage assets, the old Royal Naval College at Greenwich, the Maritime Greenwich World Heritage Site, and our bridge. And although he found the harm would be less than substantial, he concluded the public benefits of the scheme wouldn't outweigh that harm, because there was a fallback position, the 700 home scheme, and that delivered most of the benefits. So he found that the additional benefits didn't outweigh the harm by way of the impact on the heritage assets. He found the proposal would fail to preserve the setting of the old Royal Naval College and the World Heritage site, because it would distract from the ability to appreciate the listing of certain views from Greenwich Park. And also very critical about the effect on preserving the setting of the Tower Bridge. Now, he also found that it failed to adhere to the emerging policy on affordable housing, so the benefits were muted in that sense. But the Secretary of State rejected that analysis, and what we might note is that in the decision letter, the Secretary of State has said at paragraph 7, he was aware that the council received a draft report from the examiner of the council's still drafting charging schedule on the 12th of September, and they anticipated to adopt it on the 15th of January 2020. But the day before the decision is issued, saving the developer what is estimated to be between 30 and 50 million pounds. Now, it's that particular point that Sasha took, and the GLA also challenged the decision, that with Melissa Murphy, and the impression that that gives, that the decision was made to avoid making that payment. And this is what the Secretary of State has said. He concedes that the timing would lead the fair-minded and informed observer to conclude that there was a real possibility that he was biased in favour of the developer. Now, I've never seen that before. We've all challenged Secretary of State decisions, but that is an extraordinary admission. And what it also means is that there won't be any disclosure in the case, because no doubt, and Sasha will tell us about this, the Tower Hamlets were seeking disclosure between the developer and the government over what had happened. And because they've consented to judgment, that disclosure will now not take place. This has been dynamite in the sense that it's been the leading article in the Times newspaper yesterday. The BBC were reporting on this yesterday. And there are lots of questions to be asked. And if people say, well, what role do lawyers have in the planning system? This is the role lawyers play in the planning system. When things like this happen, you need to issue proceedings, seek disclosure, and get to the truth. And we now have a very, very clear admission from the Secretary of State of apparent bias. And well done, Sasha. Well done.
And Sasha, you're going to tell us how on earth such an extraordinary success was achieved by the claimants, despite their legal representation.
Well, I'm going to say, I think, Chris, your summary was very succinct and absolutely accurate. I mean, in all seriousness, I want to make a few points.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris is absolutely right. I think all of us, I mean, when you think the hard work, I mean, this is particularly relevant for David, and I want to particularly commend David Prentice. Not that he found his recommendation, but there are inspectors on the ground putting a huge amount of work into coming to fair and even-handed decisions. And in this case, he came to a view, and then we have a Secretary of State reaching a view the day before, as Chris has said. And then, I mean, the concession by the Secretary of State, this is a consent order. The Secretary of State is accepting that a fair-minded and informed observer would lead to a conclusion there's a real possibility that the first defendant was biased. I mean, how have we got a situation where the Secretary of State is accepting that that could be possibly happen? I mean, it's so serious. And all of you who are concerned about this, look at Jenrick's interview yesterday with Adam Bolton, because frankly, when you read the consent order and read it and see his answers, well, I'm not going to comment because I might be in trouble, but you all need to look at that. But I also wanted to say that, as Chris has said, I mean, the other significant thing is there's been no release of the material. And I think this is the start of something, because there will be further steps to try and see the material. Because as Chris says, this isn't just relevant for West Ferry, it's relevant for a credible, fair an even-handed appeal system. And a Secretary of State who concedes on the basis of apparent bias is probably politically a dead duck, frankly, because how can people have a view about the fairness of the system if there is consent orders accepting that he acted in a way which led to these conclusions? So it's pretty serious, frankly, and it's pretty serious for the long-term credibility of the system that we all care about.
And another illustration that judicial, despite all that we've said about the difficulty of bringing a judicial review claim, in the right case it can work. I mean, two of our three cases, all three of our three cases actually involved some kind of success, albeit Dill was a sort of a curate's egg, I suppose, in one level for Mr. Dill. But it does show that judicial review is a meaningful remedy in the right case, despite the difficulties that claimants can face in some cases. We need to move on, and I'm going to touch upon the appeal of the week before we get to our interview with David. And I should say at the beginning, thanks Nick Lee, who I know is listening, for suggesting this. And can I just encourage, please do send suggestions in either on our LinkedIn page, or if you know one or more of us, email us for case of the week or appeal of the week or anything else. We really, we welcome feedback on what we should and shouldn't be covering. So Nick, thank you for this. It's the Gascoigne Wood interchange. Is the name of the appeal decision. It was issued about 12 days ago by Kevin Ward. It was out on application on a Greenfield Park previously developed site, described as a demolition of a quarry buildings and 2 million square foot of class B2 and B8, principally B2 B8 floor space, on a site which had rail connections, but to all intents and purposes, the inspector noted it was a strategic rail freight interchange, 101 hectare site. So actually, just make feeling for the scale of it, roughly 40% of it was green field. It was near the settlement of Sherburn in Elmlet. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, given the part of the country it's in, but Paul will correct me. It was outside the development limits, so formerly in the countryside. And another material fact is that the appellant estimated, I didn't see any real gainsaying of it, 4,646 full-time equivalent jobs. So that gives you a feel for the scale of the economic consequences. But in contrast to the West Midlands SRFI DCO Greenbelt case that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, this one failed through the conventional planning process. And the main failing was the inspector wasn't convinced of the need case. It was in the countryside, so it fell up. It wasn't in the Greenbelt, in contrast to the DCO case, which succeeded. But it came up against the face of development plan policies that were quite prescriptive about what could and couldn't be in the countryside. And the inspector didn't think that the need case fell within any of those policies. On a local level, he noted that the scale was such that just the greenfield element alone of that development would basically equate to the whole of the district's employment land needs for the development plan period. And so the scale of development was beyond that which he thought would justify the countryside location. He didn't see a wider need case beyond the local plan, beyond the local level to justify the development. He didn't think there was at least yet a basis to consider the local plan was the local plan employment need figures were out of date, so the tilted balance didn't apply. He did say that there were significant economic benefits, not least all those jobs, the economic implications, revenue generation, the ecological benefit, quite significant ecological benefits. It was an SRFI in all but name, and therefore it got the support of the national policy statement identifying a national need. But despite all of that, he said there was a lack of substantive evidence which clearly demonstrates a specific need for such a facility in this particular location, the district as a whole, or the surrounding area. And there's a lack of evidence quantifying the need for employment land connected to a rail freight interchange. So the lack of a need, despite this not being a Greenbelt case, was what did for that. It's quite hard to tell, I think, without being involved in the case, how much of that was the inspector's sort of approach to risk, and how much of it was the shortcomings in the evidential case, and how much of it was just a bad site. It's quite hard to tell. It may well be a combination of the three. But I think what I would say is it at least arguably on the face of it reinforces what I said about the DCO case from the Midlands, that in infrastructure cases, often the case that the bigger the scheme and the bigger its commensurate impacts, the bigger the prospects it has of succeeding. And it may well be that this one was too big but not big enough, if you see what I mean. And actually, if it was a bit bigger, and perhaps in a different location too, but a bit bigger, qualified for the DCO process, arguably the decision might have been different. Also, it's notable as well that there was a further reason the inspector identified for refusal, which wasn't a reason in the council's reasons for refusal, namely that it was too poorly served by public transport and wouldn't be a sustainable location for travel to work for those 4,500 odd employees. That was a point that third parties took, including Sam Smith, where again I don't know the graphics they don't really work, but Sam Smith of the beer fame, using the irrepressible Peter Village, scored a very impressive success by getting an inspector to agree as a freestanding reason for use, something that wasn't in the council's reasons for use. So a cautionary note, should anyone need one, not to be dismissed as a third-party objections, because just because the council doesn't take them.
Don't stooge to Village, Charlie.
Can I just make a couple of comments in relation to just make a couple of comments in relation to that. First of all, can I apologise? I've just moved away from Hagrid's hut. I'm now standing just outside Chris's house. If you look over my shoulder, this side, you can see Chris has just opened his wallet. It's extraordinary. Secondly, it's Sherburn in Elmet. Elmet being the former sub-Roman kingdom in South Yorkshire. So it's a place which is well worth visiting, if I may say so. Third thing, which is my only really substantive point on this one, this is one of the cases where when you read the decision, the inspector promises that the cost decision is going to be really interesting, because he says he's going to deal with one of Peter Village's submissions by saying, well, this is actually a DCO and it's unreasonable to pursue it by way of planning application. So I went to the cost decision thinking, finally, we're going to get an inspector of Kevin Ward's standing telling us why you shouldn't pursue a Section 78 when something really ought to be a DCO. And he ducks it. Oh. So he promised much and failed to deliver in the cost decision. So shame about that, Kevin.
Peter, for the objector, was saying it should have been a DCO, and I can't help but wonder, had it been a DCO, they might have a better chance of winning. It would have been a much more expensive.
That's probably wrong.
Well, Charlie, should we get on to David, because he's been so patient. It's comparative to him waiting for a Spurs League title. So I think, to be fair, he's been very patient. And I must say, David, we're all very impressed with your football kit.
Yeah, very good.
I want to, first of all, just for the benefit of those that are watching, can you just briefly describe what do you actually do? What does your job mean as head of appeals?
Yeah, so it's professional lead rather than head of appeals. So I've been an inspector for 20 years, as Charlie said earlier. So I've had a lot of time sitting, waiting and listening to barristers talk. Appeals and local plans, but I'm not doing that anymore. So I'm not actually doing active casework now. And the professional leads at the Planning Inspectorate, there are 5 of us, and we cover the main casework areas, which is appeals, local plans, enforcement, infrastructure. It's a newish role and not fully going to be effective until the 1st of July. And I suppose the main focus is about professional excellence and standards, making sure they're maintained and increased amongst inspectors, making sure inspectors have the information, advice and training that they need to equip them to do their job as a decision maker, as well as some assurance of the outcomes of their work as well. Another aspect of the role is to represent the inspector profession within the organisation. So there's an inspector perspective in organisational matters, and also, as is probably evidenced by this event, to have an outward-facing role of external engagement. And I think these are all things that PINS has done before. So the stuff isn't particularly new, but the role aims to bring a greater focus, I think, to those sorts of activities, as well as perhaps a more strategic approach.
Okay, and we've obviously, as Mary and Charlie have flagged up, we've had today the publication of more inquiries and hearings to be held virtually in June. And can I just ask you various questions? The first one that I've got to ask you, because Peterborough is absolutely the whole planning bar and the whole of our profession is alive to virtual events. And the comment, we are learning from each event with the aim of making virtual events our standard option for the majority of events in future. And I want to ask you about in future, does that mean during some form of COVID affected timescale, or are we talking about the longer term?
So I think our position is that it's for the time being, and it's not saying that it's going to be virtual events forever and ever. So this is the position as we stand now, is the best way to move things forward. But I think, and certainly from an inspector perspective, we would like to see, or we would like to continue with face-to-face events when that is actually safe and possible to do so. That's my view anyway. In the future, there's likely, I think, to be more of a mix of how events are run. So I think virtual might be part of that mix. But it's certainly, what we're saying is, yeah, virtual now. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the future.
Okay. And tell us, as a consequence of that, let's just go back in terms of the past 10 weeks of lockdown. What this obviously specifies it, but what have inspectors actually been doing during the lockdown?
So I think it's just worth reflecting on the fact that the nature of the role of inspectors, just for a minute for viewers, just to put them in the picture about that. So inspectors home-based have been for many years, so we're well used to working at home, and we're set up for it. But inspectors have been affected in the same way as everybody else, in terms of those that are having to now homeschool, self-isolate or shield people that they live with. So there has been a reduction in our sort of available working capacity. Nevertheless, we've been sending out decisions, 2,500 since the lockdown began, is the figure that I have. And also inspectors have been preparing for the cases that they were unable to visit during that time. In local plans and infrastructure, work's been going on in those examinations. And now that travel is possible again, we've arranged 600 appeal and enforcement visits during the course of May. So it's getting back to sort of normal kind of levels of that sort of thing. And that will continue into June and July. We're trying to maximise the capacity of inspectors to actually do as many visits as we can. Just worth reflecting that written reps is obviously a very big part of what we do. About 85% of our cases are written reps, planning appeals, and at this moment in time we've got about over 9,000 cases in the system. So it's a lot of cases in the system go by means of written reps. And we've also been spending our time, professional leads and other senior inspectors been working on the virtual events work, trying to work out how to do it and face up to the challenges that we have. I know people would rather we have gone more quickly, but I think we have found a number of challenges, both in terms of technology, getting everybody to engage, all the parties to engage, and at the same time ensuring that there's fair participation for everybody with an interest in the appeal, recognising it's a public event.
So in terms of the future, as you say, next month, what we're going to see is we're going to have 10 hearings, 8 inquiries, and 15 hearings relating to nationally significant infrastructure. So
yeah,
that is what effectively the rollout is in June. Yeah. And we see, for those that are in the system, obviously all of us have clients who are absolutely desperate to know what's happening to their appeals in the system. Is it the intention? Will you give priority over those things, those appeals that have been delayed, effectively within the system? I mean, all of us have had appeals in May and June that have been postponed. Will those effectively be given priority over appeals that are currently joining the queue, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's really a matter for our operations team to resolve, but I get the point entirely. I think one of the issues we're going to have is matching the work to the inspector, and to make sure that we can do that in a fair way, and we've got the right inspector to do the work. And obviously we're going to be learning from the first inquiry cases in particular that we do. So I think we'll have to reflect on that. But so I don't think I could sit here and guarantee, oh yes, there'll be a very clear sequence of how that's being done. But clearly we take the point that there is a fairness issue in terms of how we work out what goes next.
And have you also got a sense, I mean, obviously, as I'm sure you've got a sense from doing your appeal work, your case work, that appellants place a huge premium on time. And obviously the Rosewell inquiry reforms were aimed at trying to speed the process out. Is it a clear consideration that the appellants will be given, we'll try and resolve appeals as soon as possible?
Well, yes, absolutely. Yes, we want to do our bit and get through as many cases as we possibly can. That's the expectation of government, and that's the expectation we have of ourselves.
And what was the output of the hearing, the mock hearing that you referred to in this latest statement? Was there general favouritism towards how the process worked?
Yes, so I could say a few things about that. I mean, essentially, the message from the inspector certainly was that it went well. The case has now been decided, and if viewers are interested, I'll give you the reference, which is 3241270. It was a case involving an agricultural dwelling in Cornwall. There was only one issue in the case, which is to do with the need for the dwelling. There were no visual issues at all, so the inspector didn't need to visit the site. And the representation at the hearing were just the two main parties, so there was no third party interest. And the inspector ran it just like a normal hearing. A face-to-face hearing would have been done. And that all seemed to work well. Parties were able to give their views in the way they would normally do at a hearing. The main technical issue was a bit of background noise that came through, so that was solved by asking people to mute their microphones. I think one other thing, or a couple of other things is worth saying, is that the inspector's approach was to have fairly short sessions for the hearing. It wasn't a very long hearing, about 3.5 hours, that he had 3 separate sessions. Because, and I think a number of us will be experiencing this, it's quite tiring looking at a screen for hours on end. So I think that may be something that we all find going forward, that there'll be shorter sessions for both inquiries and for hearings. And also we found that actually getting ready for the whole event took a long time. There was a lot of effort, even though it's a small case, took a lot of effort to actually get to open it. Now that may clearly improve as time goes on and we get more used to it. But then again, there may be more challenges if there are more parties involved. So yes, a thumbs up from us in terms of how it went, and certainly from the inspector. And I'm not prepared to say what he was wearing waist down.
Before I let my colleagues pitch in, can I just ask you finally, obviously this is a brave new world for all of us, what would be your advice to those appellants and local authorities in the system? How can they help your inspectors in virtual appeals? What would be the kind of takeaway points you'd want to get across?
Yeah, thank you. There's a few things, and obviously it is new for all of us. Just referring back to a conversation last week involving Steve Quartermain, I think rule number 1 is obviously not annoy the inspector. So that's the first thing for everyone, please. And I think about this, I think all the good practice that's building up in terms of appeals is writ even larger, I think, now with virtual events. So I think we would ask everybody involved to be positive about them. Firstly, embrace it, because this is the way that it's going to be. Acting in a cooperative fashion, obviously that's good thing. Brevity, I think, always a good thing, but I think as we move into virtual world, I think that's going to be even more important. I suspect there'll be more focus on timeliness, dare I say, and time estimates and that sort of thing. So that's going to be a big thing. Focus, sticking to the key issues that are in dispute, not pursuing hopeless points. One other thing is actually how to deal with inquiry documents. It's cropping up as an issue, and I think it's going to be very helpful for the main parties to work out how that's going to be done at an early stage, perhaps by setting up some sort of web page in a similar fashion to a local plan examination. Also, if there are post the case conference call, if things are agreed between the parties, then please keep the inspector cited on that so that she or he is aware of what's going on, and that may lead to some adjustment in terms of witnesses and such like. Duration, I think we're probably expecting that, rather than 5 days, you may be scheduled for 8 days, just for the shorter time that I was talking about. And obviously a plea that is sort of on the day, that everybody behaves well and doesn't abuse the technology by speaking when they're not meant to. So a number of practical things there, I think, that can help inspectors and sort of help us all work with this. And I think there'll be more lessons to be learned as we go through and do the first ones. First ones, I think, is about 15th of June. As we learn that, there'll be lessons learned, and hopefully sharing of good practice. And we want to be leading on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask Paul, what do you want to ask David?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just musing on the 15th of June. That's the week after the inquiry I've just had adjourned, so just missed. Yeah, David, I'm more interested in a general issue, which is the interface between hearings and inquiries. Since PINs were given the power to select the mode of hearing, section 319, etc., 319A, ever larger scaled developments are now being dealt with by hearings rather than inquiries. That's got a couple of consequences, one of which is inspectors are perhaps getting less experience of dealing with inquiries and the formality of evidence, etc. And there is a feeling, and I work for both sides of the table, that there's perhaps less scrutiny for some of the bigger sites which warrant additional scrutiny. Regulation 11 of the hearings procedure rules allows cross-examination where the inspector thinks it's appropriate. Is the obvious solution to those two problems to allow some degree of targeted questions during hearings, to allow inspectorial experience of a mini inquiry type situation, and also to show that level of scrutiny?
Okay, so I mean, it's certainly right. From when I started, there were inquiries lasted for a day or two, and that doesn't seem to be the norm anymore. So there has been a change in that respect. I think what we say to our inspectors, and they know this, that in a hearing there is an inquisitorial burden, and they are encouraged to exercise that. So I'm not sure that there is necessarily inadequate scrutiny. When barristers do attend hearings, in my experience, yes, I've got to say it's generally helpful, because they can often focus the discussion and highlight weaknesses in the opposition's cases, but I'm not sure that necessarily goes into cross-examination. And I mean, the whole procedure is a matter for the inspector, so if they're satisfied that it can be dealt with as a hearing, then that's it, rather than by an inquiry. And obviously running a hearing tests other skills as well, in terms of inspectors exploring the evidence, asking their own questions. That's good preparation for roundtable discussions. I suspect that, there's my personal view, in future there may be more flexibility, there may be more movement between the two procedures. We won't be more rigidly stuck into inquiry or hearing, and there may be more of a blending of the procedures, I think, to suit the issues. So I think it'll be dealt with it'll move forward in that way, is my personal expectation. So more of a blurred approach to what there is now.
I think we agree then, David. Thank you.
Good.
Right, do you want to, should we have Mary? Mary, do you have a follow-up question?
I do, actually. One of the other differences between hearings and inquiries is that there's no active case management by the appointed inspector in the case of hearings. And is there not some merit in deploying this tool to assist in the determination of these more complex cases which are being dealt with through hearings? Because it seems to me that that would give the inspectors the experience of running such events, but also it would give the main parties the opportunity to ask questions. The inspector can identify the main issues, the inspector can set the timetable with the help of the main parties, and those main parties may, for example, want to suggest that this is a case where there is an issue which needs cross-examination, or they may wish to suggest, and I've certainly had this experience, that it's a case which would be appropriate for, say, a scheme architect to present a PowerPoint presentation or a slide or some evidence about the scheme. And if there was more active case management, I suggest it could make for more effective management and determination of the hearings. Might you think about that?
Yes, I mean, certainly I think from an inspector's perspective, the case management conference approach that was introduced after Rosewell in inquiry cases has been beneficial, helpful to inspectors, and hopefully helpful to all the participants as well. So yes, in theory, I could see that could usefully be used in some hearing cases. I mean, as it stands at the moment, inspectors are already encouraged to be proactive in their review of hearing cases and to think ahead and ask for additional information, clarify points, and even to start to indicate what they think the main issues are. So that's already something they're encouraged to do. There is a practical problem. I mean, 650 hearings a year. The practical problem is just about programming and having the inspector available at the right time to actually do that pre-event work. So I think there's a practical issue. And one of the improvement projects that PINS is running at the moment is all about our scheduling. So that sort of thing may become easier to facilitate in the future. I guess there'll also be an issue about which cases are the ones that would fall into that category. Yes. So I think we're kind of on the same page, and we recognise the benefits. It's actually just seeing how that could work in practice.
Thank you.
Right, then shall we, Chris?
Just very briefly, David, if I may, looking at the time. First of all, the reason I'm drinking champagne is simply because I've had 2 case management conferences today. Both of those inquiries have gone virtual. I've got 3 now, 1 in June, 2 in July. I've had case management conferences with Christina Downs and Maya Hayden, and it's very clear that PINS have been doing a lot of work on this, and they've got very clear guidance, and it's very, very welcome. So don't misunderstand my question, but I think that everything you've done now, albeit it could have been done a bit earlier, is terrific, okay? And we're very, very grateful, and inquiries are up and running, and that's really important. However, my question is this. Nobody really likes spending this long on the screen, unless you're my 9-year-old son and you can do 17 hours on a plane playing Minecraft, okay? But this isn't healthy, this isn't normal, but it's something we're doing in a situation where there isn't an alternative. Please, please tell us that the inspectors, the people out there like you for 20 years, don't really want to do this permanently, despite the fact that some things have been said that suggest that.
Yeah, so I think I've covered this already and said that, yeah, from an inspector point of view, I don't think we or I personally would want to see the end of face-to-face events. This is where we are now, and let's hope that things improve. And we've talked also about a mix of a more flexible approach to the nature of events. So that's an inspector perspective on it. We'll see where it goes as an organisation. But from an inspector perspective, no, strangely enough, we actually kind of quite enjoy the events and seeing you people in front of us most of the time.
Charlie,
last question to wrap up. Does PINS or do you, if you prefer to answer it personally, feel that the inspectorate currently has the right balance of private and public sector experience amongst its inspectors? And an associated point, is PINS amenable to more publicly visible and accessible information about inspectors' professional backgrounds, not their kind of bank details and addresses, but their professional backgrounds, being made available online, as is done, for example, for High Court judges on the Judiciary website, Northern Ireland Planning Appeal Commissioners to a lesser extent, and hello to the one commissioner who's watching this right now, on the PAC website. Is that something that would be considered?
Okay, so two parts of that. I couldn't tell you what the background of inspectors are, but I know in terms of public or private, I'm not sure that particularly matters. The main thing for us is that we employ inspectors who can do the job and have the right skills. I know there are many who have very different backgrounds and experiences, so there's a big variety in both planning and other fields that we employ. So I'm not sure that the public-private split is particularly relevant to the role. Once they're inspector, they're an inspector. In terms of details, yeah, I mean, we tell people who's being appointed and what their qualifications are, and you get to see that on the decision letter as well. I mean, I think one of the things PINS does want to do generally is to be more engaged in the mainstream planning world, but I'm not totally convinced that further biographical detail is a particular priority at this moment in time.
Understood. Thanks very much, David. Again, I say we're really grateful to have a real inspector who's been driving the current agenda. So thank you again, and you'll be welcome back on a future if you'd like to come back in full Spurs top to tail regalia.
Yeah, I'm working up to it.
Right. Well, finally, then, just to wrap up, we've got quickly Champion of the Week and then Nudge of the Week. So, Champion of the Week, Mary, over to you.
My champion of the week is the National Infrastructure Commission, because they produced a report this week which made what I think is a very good point, which is that they made a call for better land use planning for freight as a sector, making the point that really it's rather overlooked and sometimes rather lost in the absence of regional planning. And perhaps the Gascoigne Wood case is another example of what can happen, actually, where there's inadequate planning. And so I salute them for that. I also think that one of the problems sometimes with freight is that it doesn't fit into the straitjacket of local planning authority administrative areas, nor does it necessarily fit into the straitjacket of housing market areas when you're planning through the local plan process. Also, I would like to commend, if I'm allowed to, please, the Secretary of State this week, because of his decisions to call in 4 applications, all of which are related to logistic facilities. And I think there may be a connection between the recognition that there is inadequate support for planning for this sector in land use terms and the Secretary of State's decision.
Thanks, Mary. Paul, Nudge of the Week.
Yeah, I'm going to do one under the title "You Couldn't Make It Up." Yesterday, the Highways England, God bless them, announced the consultation on the project that I was involved in first 15 years ago, which is the dualling of the A66. Bits of it are dual. That was the inquiry I did some time ago. There is a document called the Options Consultation Report, which looks at the ways in which you can access Barnard Castle. I am not joking. Options L and K tell you how you can get to Barnard Castle more quickly from Scotch Corner. It's almost as if there's somebody linked to high up in the administration who has a particular desire to be there. I don't know. So my nudge of the week is the Secretary of State say get on with it, because I think people want to get to Barnard Castle. It's a truly beautiful place.
If you can see it. You have to get your eyes tested first.
Can I just say, Johnny, before you do it, we've talked about Robert Jendrick's decision in Westbury, but I imagine what really happened was a sketch out of In the Thick of It, where Dominic Cummings actually comes into the room and explains the decision needs to be issued tomorrow. I think that's maybe what has happened.
I'll pass no comments. Before we wrap up, one last thing. Paul's far too modest to say that in his non-virtual background, you can see now in what looks to you like the right-hand corner, there is a picture that rotates every week. And I believe every week it's some fantastic artwork done by Mrs. T herself. And she has got a website. I commend it to you. I have acquired one of the pieces myself, which I'm very excited about. So shout out to Ursula from
Should we put the link on, Charlie? Should we put the link on our LinkedIn page? So everyone can see Mrs. Tucker's artwork.
Thank you all.
And before I rival Roger Clues, can I just ask when her barber shop opens?
when your Chorley inquiry resumes, Chris.
Okay, all right.
On the subject of hair. Thank you all very much for joining us again, particularly on a sunny evening when you would have had the option of watching us on YouTube afterwards. Really appreciate that. Once again, David, thank you for coming on and facing our questions.
Absolutely. I think, Charlie, we've got quite an interesting guest next week as well, haven't we?
Lord Matthew Taylor, no less, the author, amongst other things, of the well-known review of Garden Cities. We'll send out details on the flyer and put them on the LinkedIn page in the usual way. Don't forget to update your Zoom. It's mandatory as of the 30th of May. Please don't forget to consider donations. Have a great evening, a great weekend, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.